Distinguished ministers, briefers, ambassadors, and all those watching us online today, let me welcome you on behalf of Estonia and 23 co-sponsors: France, Ireland, Norway, the United Kingdom, the United States, Australia, Belgium, Bulgaria, Canada, Costa Rica, the Czech Republic, Georgia, Germany, Greece, Honduras, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Poland, Slovakia, Turkey, and Ukraine. Such a large number of co-sponsors clearly demonstrates that unfolding tragedy in Crimea is a grave concern for all countries all over the world. Maintaining peace depends on how states comply with mutually agreed norms and international law. This is the road to a less violent world. 7 years have passed since Russia rolled into Crimea, orchestrated a fast sham referendum, and annexed the territory of Ukraine. The takeover of Crimea by Russia in February 2014 was not just a tragedy for Ukraine, it was a watershed moment for the entire post-World War II international order. Respect for territorial integrity and the prohibition of the use of force are fundamental principles of international law that stands at the core of the United Nations. Today's meeting will focus on the deterioration of human rights situation in Crimea, Russia's massive military buildup in the region, and economic and environmental decline on the ground. Today, we give voice to those who have been suppressed, silenced, and harassed. Our distinguished briefers will give a valuable contribution to the discussion thanks to their expertise, knowledge, and personal engagement. Allow me now to make some organizational remarks. We have 38 speakers today, including 7 ministers and 6 vice ministers. There will be a keynote speech by Ms. Ilze Kehris, Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. After that, we will see a video message by civic journalists from Crimea, and then our 2 distinguished briefers will speak. Thereafter, we will hear statements by co-sponsors, Security Council members, and other members of the United Nations, and by 1 observer. All participants are invited to present their questions to the briefers while making interventions. After the last statement, each briefer will have 3 minutes for comments. Our working language is English. Today's meeting is streamed via live and open to the public via several channels: United Nations Web TV, Facebook, and YouTube. The recording will remain publicly accessible after the meeting. We will post the full version of your statements online. Please be so kind and send them to the email address you are seeing on the screen. Without further delay, allow me now to introduce our distinguished speaker. I now invite Ms. Ilze Kehris to address us. Ms. Kehris has in-depth expertise in conflict prevention and human rights, and extensive work experience with international and regional organizations and civil society. She served as a member of the United Nations Human Rights Committee from 2017 to 2019. Ms. Kehris, the floor is yours.
Your Excellency, Minister Linus, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this opportunity to brief on the human rights situation in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol in Ukraine. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has been monitoring, reporting, and advocating on human rights issues in Crimea since March 2014 on the basis of relevant United Nations General Assembly resolutions, including Resolution 68/262, which affirmed the territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. OHCHR has not had unfettered access to Crimea, and its human rights monitoring mission in Ukraine has continued to conduct monitoring activities remotely through interviews with victims and witnesses of alleged human rights violations, as well as other stakeholders, collection of public information such as court registries and official statistics, and analysis of legislation of Ukraine and the Russian Federation which impacts the enjoyment of human rights in Crimea. Our office will continue to seek unimpeded access to Crimea in line with relevant General Assembly resolutions. I urge the concerned countries to depoliticize the issue of access so as to ensure that OHCHR, as well as other independent international human rights organizations, may better promote and protect the enjoyment and full realization of all human rights of the population residing in Crimea. Excellencies, OHCHR continues to receive credible information alleging torture and ill treatment by the Russian Federation Security Service and Police in Crimea of individuals deprived of their liberty both before and after their admission into places of detention. In particular, perpetrators have allegedly used torture and ill treatment to force victims to self-incriminate or to testify against others, as well as in retaliation for their political affiliation or position. However, despite reports that some investigations have been initiated, OHCHR has not yet received information on any prosecution or other progress in ensuring accountability for such acts. Furthermore, detainees as well as their lawyers and relatives have complained to OHCHR about the conditions of detention in penitentiary institutions in Crimea, which could amount to inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, or in some cases, torture. Their complaints include insufficient personal living space in prison cells, inadequate heat, lack of ventilation, poor hygiene conditions, and inadequate nutrition. The medical care available is reportedly rudimentary, with only basic painkillers in supply. In addition, requests for medical examinations in external healthcare facilities were often refused, seemingly without proper justification. Impunity for past serious human rights violations continues to be an issue of concern. In my previous briefing on Crimea to this Council during the Arria-formula meeting on 6th of March 2020, I spoke of the arbitrary detentions and enforced disappearances of 43 individuals between 2014 and 2018, which had been documented by OHCHR. The alleged perpetrators include members of militia groups, agents of the Russian Federal Security Service, and other law enforcement authorities, including Crimean police. To date, no individual has been prosecuted in relation to any of these cases. I reiterate OHCHR's call for effective, that is prompt, thorough, impartial, and independent investigations into all such cases. Excellencies, the Russian Federation continues to apply the entirety of its legislation, including criminal law, in Crimea, contrary to its obligations as an occupying power under international humanitarian law. This has particularly impacted pro-Ukrainian activists, critics of the occupation of Crimea, and individuals believed to be members or sympathizers of religious organizations banned under Russian law, but legal in Ukraine. Notably, OHCHR has documented how the application of Russian legislation restricts fundamental freedoms in Crimea, in particular, freedom of expression. Numerous media outlets and individual journalists have informed OHCHR that the threat of criminal prosecution based on charges of broadly defined extremism and new Russian Federation legislation criminalizing insults towards state authorities and the distribution of false information of public importance has led them to self-censor the content of their publications, conceal their authorship, or limit their reporting to non-political topics. Other journalists residing outside the peninsula have been banned from entering Crimea by the Federal Security Service or have decided not to risk physical entry into Crimea. In September 2020, a Crimean Tatar journalist, who is also an activist of the civic group Crimean Solidarity, was released from prison after serving 2.5 years for a series of videos he has published online. 4 of the 5 impugned videos were uploaded in 2013, prior to the commencement of the occupation of Crimea. Russian criminal law was applied retroactively, violating the principle of legality, and while a Russian military court convicted him of public calls to terrorism, it was not clear from the court's decision which specific statements in the videos it considered illegal. OHCHR has previously reported how Crimean Tatars were disproportionately subjected to raids of private homes, businesses, and meeting places by the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation and local police. The occupation authorities justified the majority of these searches by the need to seize materials linked to political or religious groups which are banned in the Russian Federation, but which, however, operate legally and freely in Ukraine. Approximately 74% of the searches documented by OHCHR since 1st of January 2017 involved property of Crimean Tatars. OHCHR continued to document such cases this year. Most recently, a series of 7 raids and arrests carried out on 17th of February 2021, 5 of which targeted Crimean Tatars. OHCHR also continues to document restrictions on the freedom of religion or belief. Throughout 2019 to 2020, the occupation authorities in Crimea adopted decisions and pursued judicial proceedings to evict the Orthodox Church of Ukraine from its central cathedral in Simferopol, 250 parishioners, and to dismantle the church in Yevpatoria, 100 parishioners. Those comprise the 2 largest places of worship of the church in Crimea. During this time, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine repeatedly sought official recognition and registration from the Russian Ministry of Justice in line with Russian Federation laws on religious organizations. The local offices of the Russian Ministry of Justice consistently denied registration on the grounds that the church had misused the legal deadline for re-registration during the transition period, shortly after the beginning of occupation, and that re-registration could not be done retrospectively. The Archbishop of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine in Crimea considers the denial of registration as retaliation for his pro-Ukrainian position and that of his parishioners. Despite the prohibition under international humanitarian law to compel protected persons to serve in the armed forces of an occupying power, male residents of Crimea continue to be conscripted to serve in the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Since 2015, no less than 26,000 male Crimean residents have been conscripted, with 5,000 conscripted in 2020 alone. A number of these conscripts were transferred to serve on military bases in the Russian Federation. Those unwilling to serve face criminal prosecution for draft evasion, punishable by up to 2 years of imprisonment. Excellencies, OHCHR has previously expressed its concern over the impact of regulatory measures introduced in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which have severely restricted freedom of movement across the administrative boundary line between Crimea and mainland Ukraine. Ukrainian nationals without Russian passports or resident permits in Crimea continue to face restricted entry to the peninsula by the occupation authorities. At the same time, Ukrainian citizens who also hold Russian passports and are thus considered Russian citizens by the occupying authorities are banned from traveling from Crimea to mainland Ukraine. If they present their Ukrainian travel documents in order to try to cross the administrative boundary line into mainland Ukraine, they face fines and/or travel bans issued by Russian Federation border guards. While exceptions allowing for crossing the administrative boundary line based on humanitarian grounds exist, some of these grounds can be lawfully applied only once. For example, Ukrainian citizens holding Russian passports were allowed to leave Crimea for the purposes of education or employment or to provide care for close relatives in mainland Ukraine, but only once during the pandemic. OHCHR also received information from multiple sources that in relation to restrictions at the administrative boundary line introduced by the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian border service officials did not always apply the criteria of humanitarian grounds in a consistent and transparent manner. Excellencies, in closing, I wish to highlight that yesterday, OHCHR published its 31st periodic report on the human rights situation in Ukraine, which, as always, includes a section on Crimea. The report is available to download from the OHCHR website. In addition, I recall that the General Assembly has requested the Secretary General to issue 2 reports this year on the implementation of General Assembly Resolution 75/192 on the situation of human rights in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, Ukraine. The interim report will be presented to the Human Rights Council at its 47th session in June, and the final report will be presented to the General Assembly at its 76th session. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Kehris, for bringing your valuable expertise to this debate today. Now, I am glad to broadcast a video message by Mr. Memedeminov, Crimean civic journalist. He has been covering the situation of Crimean Tatars with a focus on politically motivated court cases. In 2018, he was imprisoned. He got released last year. Please, Mr. Memedeminov, you have the floor.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nariman Memedeminov. I have been living in Crimea since 1992 after my family returned from the places of deportation. I graduated from Territorial National Economic University, specializing in international economics. My civic journalism was spontaneous because the searches and arrests on Crimean Tatars, Crimean Muslims, were not covered at all, and it was necessary to shed light on what was happening. I have been publishing posts on social media since mid-2014. It was time when certain so-called extremists and terrorists suddenly appeared in Crimea, and the Crimean Tatars turned overnight into extremists and terrorists. The first high-profile case that I covered was the case of the Crimean Tatars from Sevastopol, Nuri Primov, Ferat Seyfulayev, Rustem Vaitov, and Ruslan Zeytullayev. Then the Crimean Solidarity Association was established, where I was a media coordinator. This activity, which covered persecution, politically motivated cases, life of families of political prisoners, was necessary because professional media do not work in Crimea anymore, of course, not by their own choice. Russian special services searched my house, where I live with my wife and 3 young children, twice, in 2016 and 2018. After a search on 22 of March 2018, I was arrested and accused of publicly calling for terrorist activities. The reason for arrest were several videos I shot in 2013. I did not admit my guilt because, of course, I haven't made any calls to carry out terrorist activities. In principle, such calls or activities contradict my life views, contradict the Crimean Tatar culture, which comes from the Islam religion. On 21 of September 2020, after 2 years and 6 months of imprisonment, I was released and returned to my native Crimea, to my family and loved ones, to my people. Now, I do not have any social media accounts due to the ban of such activities. Doing journalism is not possible, but everyone knows that today Marlen Asanov, Sergei Mustafayev, Osman Arif Mehmetov, Ruslan Bekirov, Seyran Saliyev, Ahmed Suleimanov, Timur Ibragimov and others remain in prison. Dozens of civic journalists and activists from Crimea, who in their majority are members of the Crimean Solidarity Association, continue to be in imprisonment. It is well known that since early 2021 there have already been arrests. The pressure of the Crimean Tatar Muslims people continues. However, if professional journalists and media show solidarity with civic journalists from Crimea, if independent and objective journalists make trips to Crimea, of course according to Ukrainian legislation, organize information campaigns, if journalists and diplomats visit Kurds in Rostov-on-Don, it will be even better and more efficient. If various human rights organizations, politicians, international organizations cover more broadly and massively what is happening with activists and civic journalists in Crimea, if they continue to carry out effective and purposeful actions that will be aimed at the release of political prisoners, then we will certainly reach success. So thank you for your attention.
My sincere thanks to Mr. Mehmedeminov for this courage and commitment. Our next briefer is Dr. Philip Carver, the president of Potomac Foundation. During the Cold War, Dr. Carver served as a strategy advisor to the United States Secretary of Defense and external arms control advisor to the Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. After the illegal annexation of Crimea, Ukrainian government invited Dr. Carver to serve as an independent observer of the conflict. Between 2014 and 2019, he made 32 trips to evaluate militarization in Crimea. Please, Dr. Carver, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Your Excellency. A very gracious introduction. I was asked to address the increasing militarization of Crimea by Russian military forces and the resulting security challenges for the Black Sea region. Since January 2014, Russia has significantly increased its military forces in Crimea and backed them up with a major redeployment in the adjacent areas. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. Due to the short time available for this summary, I've prepared a series of maps and empirical data on force levels that I'll show here and will be on the website for those who value details and the specifics. For those who would dispute my facts, my response is simple. Match it with your own detailed force and deployment data. Then we can talk about it. My comments are organized around three topics. First, the military invasion of Crimea. The occupation of Crimea was not an indigenous revolt, but a foreign invasion. This is not the place to go into a detailed chronology, but the sequence of events is telling. In summer 2013, while negotiating the future naval base rights of Russia in Crimea, the Russian Federation pressured Ukraine not to move towards the EU, but to join their economic sphere. A coercion that produced the pro-European Maidan protests, which grew into a mass movement, literally threatening the government. In February 2014, on the 20th to the 22nd, Russian advised security forces in Kiev killed over 100 protesters with sniper fire, which resulted in the collapse of the regime and the flight to Russia of President Yanukovych. 4 days later, Russian subversives and fellow travelers, backed up by little green men, began taking over Ukrainian government and military facilities in Crimea, followed by a suspect election, along with suppression, arrest, and even assassination of opposition leaders. 2 days later, Russian fighter aircraft dominated the skies over Crimea. Their warships blocked the Ukrainian Black Sea Fleet, while waves of assault and transport helicopters initiated the military invasion, followed by landings of major combatant units ferried across the Kerch Strait. Over the next month, starting in early April, Russian forces massed on Ukraine's eastern border and began hostilities there using the Crimean model in the Donbass and initiating the bleeding conflict that continues today. I arrived as an observer in late March 2014 and personally observed Russian tanks, mechanized infantry, and heavy artillery on the causeway to Crimea. I also interviewed numerous Tatars, some of whom had been tortured. Ukrainian Marines from Crimea, who who were brutally beaten with broken bones by Russian occupiers, even though they were not armed. I also had a chance to interview many of the leaders of the interim Ukrainian government, who admitted, albeit with misgivings, that they had acceded to Western requests to let external negotiators persuade Russia to take or find an off-ramp rather than actively resist in Crimea. What is the significance of the military invasion of Crimea? The background in international law, I would make the following points. It is the first state territorial aggression in Europe since the end of World War II. It violates the UN Charter, Article 2. It violates specific agreements the Russians have signed, including the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and the Conventional Reduction of Forces Treaty. And is an egress violation of the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurance to Ukraine. It was a personal honor to have participated in arms control efforts, including the NPT, INF, and CFE treaties. So I honestly bemoan their passing. But the Budapest Memorandum is all too conveniently forgotten. And it's worth remembering because it has an onerous implication for the international system in the future. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine became an independent state and found themselves with 1,272 strategic warheads and 2,500 theater and tactical nuclear weapons. The new Ukrainian government did not want to be a nuclear power, but was concerned if they gave them all up, they could be bullied by their nuclear neighbor. As a result, Russia, Britain, and the United States all declared that in exchange for Ukraine surrendering those nuclear weapons, they would neither threaten the use of weapons nor impinge on Ukrainian territory or sovereignty. When confronted with blatant Russian violation, the US and UK were asked for help. But, at least for us, not willing to confront the Russians directly, the response was tepid. The response, we promised not to threaten or invade you. We didn't say we would help to defend you. Now, those listening, ask yourself, what future countries will remain in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in the face, when feeling threatened, in the face of such hollow security guarantees? My point number 2, the Russian buildup in Crimea. My second map gives a lot of the details. I'd like to highlight that between 2014 and 2020, Russian forces introduced 850 major combatant systems, a 6-fold increase in the weapons deployed on Crimea. 20,000 troops, a couple hundred tanks, more than 300 armored vehicles, 250 tubes of artillery, 70-some additional combat aircraft. But it's not just the presence of the forces, but their activities, particularly field exercises and the actual use of force, that should raise concern not only for the countries in the region, but for the entire international community, to mention only a few. The Kavkaz exercise of 2016, where amphibious and air assault offensives were staged from Crimea and included the deployment and firing of surface-to-surface nuclear-capable missiles. Zapad 2017, a massive exercise covering all Russian forces from the North Cape of Norway to the Black Sea in a presumed war with NATO, involving a practiced invasion of the Baltic region. But it also included offensive participation by Crimean forces, as well as the Russian-led and trained, equipped Donbass units. And it ended with President Putin on television, smiling and pushing the nuclear button. The 2020 Kavkaz exercise, large-scale maneuvers opposite Ukraine and the Black Sea, involving 5 armies, 3 air armies, a dozen airborne, air assault, and special ops units to rehearse, quote, the localization of armed conflict, with participation from Armenia and Russian-occupied Georgia. And this is not the end. Several weeks ago, Russia announced another massive anti-NATO exercise called Zapad 2021, be held this coming summer. The international community should also start focusing on indications and evidence of Russian reintroduction of nuclear weapons into Crimea. Ostensibly withdrawn in the 1990s, there's evidence of renewed activity at the Theodosia 13 nuclear storage site. Reports of SS-26 Iskander surface-to-surface missiles appearing in Crimea for at least a temporary deployment and then disappearing back over the Kerch Strait Bridge. Very similar to the Russian actions in Kaliningrad in the Baltics over the last decade, bringing them in, taking them out. As well as the deployment of strategic Tu-22 bombers and dual-capable strike aircraft using Crimean airfields and flying over the Baltic, as well as the potential arming of no less than 16 Russian naval combatants equipped with the dual-capable caliber missiles. Point number 3. Russian forces in Crimea and the instability of the Black Sea region. The deployment and use of Russian forces in and around the Black Sea is a serious threat to peace. It represents the continuing threat of full-scale invasion of eastern Ukraine, as well as destabilizing the delicate military balance in the Black Sea. The war in Ukraine's Donbass region cannot be separated from Crimea. It has already cost 13,000 lives, 40,000 seriously injured, and 1.5 million people displaced from their homes. It is not a frozen conflict. It's a bleeding conflict. Moreover, an offensive breakout there along the southern coast offers the high payoff land link to Crimea. The presence of thousands of Russian troops and their command of 9 mechanized brigades on Ukraine's eastern territory, combined with the air assault and amphibious forces of the 22nd Corps in Crimea, pose an omnipresent offensive threat. Further Russian use of force to impede Ukrainian access to the Sea of Azov, where they use their air, special forces, and naval to shoot up ship transports, and threats to expand the occupation of Crimea to the Kherson region of Ukraine under the guise of access to fresh water for humanitarian reasons from the Dnieper River are just examples of hotspots that could produce much greater conflagration. But this threat is not limited to Ukraine. The continuing presence of Russian peacekeeping forces in Transnistria do not stabilize Moldova. Both Bulgaria and Romania have been deeply concerned, and that's forced NATO to respond with at least symbolic forces to aid them. Russia's large-scale military presence in Syria make the relations with Turkey problematic, and recently those were exacerbated by the Azerbaijan-Armenian war. Bottom line, where is the off-ramp? The inability of the West to enforce the Minsk II agreement and the dialogue of the deaf in the Normandy 4 holds a little promise. Against all odds, and with minimal Western military support, Ukraine has not only held their own against Russian aggression, but reformed and rebuilt their battle-hardened army, which in strength is larger than the last 10 nations admitted to NATO combined. For 7 years, they've stood up to the bullying and direct attacks. But without an effective Navy and an aging Air Force, they cannot afford to modernize. How long? How long will they be able to hold out? Ukrainian membership in NATO would be a major boon to the Western alliance in defensive capability and strategic position. As the forward glaces, it diverts Russian military strength that would otherwise be applied to Central and Northern Europe, provides a security screen for new NATO members in the southern flank. Unfortunately, some members of the alliance are inhibited because Ukraine has a territorial dispute. But to speak frankly, that is hypocritical sophistry. Had that argument been made during the Cold War, Germany would not have been a part of NATO and might still be divided today. Given growing Russian hostility to the U.S., there's accelerating momentum in Washington to make Ukraine a non-NATO strategic partner with American air power operating out of Ukrainian bases, which could rebalance an unstable posture in the Black Sea. Nevertheless, the best option would be for the international community to realize their stake in Ukraine's security and forestalling a spiraling arms race in the Black Sea by unified demand for settlement of the war in Donbass and a return to the pre-annexation status quo ante in Crimea. As John Donne said 2 centuries ago, for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Carver, very much for joining us and bringing your valuable insights to our discussion today. Last but not least, I'm glad to introduce Ms. Maria Tomak, Coordinator of Media Initiative for Human Rights. Ms. Tomak has been conducting journalistic investigations of disappearances and abductions of people in Crimea and on the territory of Russia. Ms. Tomak, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear ladies and gentlemen, first of all, allow me to thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Estonia for initiating this event, as well as other UN member states for co-sponsoring it. 7 years ago, on these days, when the Russian Federation invaded Crimea, I went to the Peninsula jointly with my fellow activists to eyewitness what is going on there and to document human rights violations. Before the Russian invasion, Ukraine has never faced massive abductions and torturing and massive disappearances of people, but since 2014 we do. It started in Crimea and continued in Donbass. I would like to stress this date, February 27, 2014. That is the moment when Russia started to exercise its effective control over Crimea, not after the so-called referendum on March 16. And this was recently recognized also as a legal fact by the European Court of Human Rights. Since 2014, the human rights situation in Crimea has been deteriorating. It is reflected in the data provided by the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, as well as in the UNGA resolutions adopted annually since 2016. Unfortunately, none of the recommendations and demands listed in those resolutions have been followed by the Russian Federation. Today, in my statement, I would like to highlight emblematic stories that reflect human rights trends in occupied Crimea. Kidnappings in 2014 of Crimean Tatar and Ukrainian activists opposing the occupation, Ervin Ibrahimov, Timur Shaymardanov, Vasyl Chernysh, are not investigated. Their whereabouts remain unknown for years. Rashat Ametov, a Crimean Tatar activist who was explicitly protesting against the occupation on March 3, 2014, was kidnapped and killed. Awful traces of tortures have been found on his body. Non-investigation of his murder by the occupying authorities is absolutely deliberate, as they are the ones responsible for this crime. Human rights activists, prisoners of conscience Emir Hussein Kuku and Server Mustafayev, whose names were pointed out by the UNGA, remain imprisoned. Currently, in general, at least 108 Ukrainian citizens are held in Crimea and in Russia behind the bars within the politically motivated cases. Most of them are Crimean Tatars. 50 of them are activists of the Crimean Solidarity, the group of courageous people that document human rights violations in Crimea and provide humanitarian assistance to the families of political prisoners. Any attempts of those subjected to tortures within these 7 years to complain about it did not result in justice. In the meantime, the COVID-19 pandemic was used to cut off the access to the courtroom for the public and to prevent political prisoners from seeing their families. The representative body of the Crimean Tatar people, Majlis, is banned and criminalized, in spite of the International Court of Justice order. Anti-extremism and anti-terrorism legislation of the occupying state is misused and directed, first of all, against the indigenous population of Crimea, Crimean Tatars. The Orthodox Church of Ukraine has been targeted since the beginning of the occupation. As a result of various means of pressure, including physical violence, as well as instrumentalization of the occupying report, out of 49 religious communities of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine operating in Crimea as of 2014, only 7 remain as of 2020, and out of 23 priests, only 4 keep on serve in the peninsula. Jehovah's Witnesses became a target in recent years as well. Currently, at least 6 of them are held behind the bars. Civilians are forced to leave Crimea for mainland Ukraine to protect themselves and to protect their families from large-scale and systematic human rights abuse. In the meantime, hundreds of thousands of people are arriving to Crimea from the Russian Federation within the policy of the direct and indirect relocation. While the world tries to get rid of the consequences of colonization practices of previous centuries, Russia does just the opposite. It colonizes parts of Ukrainian territory by changing the demographic composition. Victims of the attempted annexation of Crimea are mostly men. However, women and children are heavily affected either. As of now, 191 children have been left without a father as a result of politically motivated persecution. Nevertheless, I would like to specifically emphasize the role of brave women, human rights activists, Muminesa Aliyeva, Lutfiye Zudiyeva, Lila Hemedji, and others. They continue to do their job despite the fact they themselves being persecuted. Their key message towards the international community is simple but vital: to keep an eye on Crimea, to highlight the violations that are taking place there, and to express solidarity with those persecuted. That is why Crimean Platform, an initiative proposed by Ukraine, is of huge importance. We believe it will create the precondition for the deoccupation of Crimea, which will happen sooner or later. We appreciate the support provided by the UN member states to the territorial integrity of Ukraine, as well as to human rights in the temporarily occupied territories, both Crimea and Donbass. We appreciate it even more given the great human rights challenges that the world is facing currently, with events taking place in Myanmar, Ethiopia, Hong Kong, Belarus. 22 states co-sponsored this event, and that indeed shows the global dimension of the problem of the occupied Crimea and of the Russian aggression. Attempted annexation of Crimea is an emblematic case in which the resilience of international community and its commitment to the UN principle and values is being tested, and we have no choice other than to pass this test. Therefore, we encourage all of the UN member states to join the Crimean Platform and to support its operation at all levels. We also call on the international community to impose personal sanctions against those involved in grave human rights violations in Crimea, in particular against those persecuting prisoners of conscience Emir Hussein Kuku and Sarwar Mustafayev. Thank you.
I convey our thanks to Ms. Tomak for your courage and for sharing your views. We have heard our guest speakers, and now I invite the representatives of the co-sponsors to take the floor. I would like to give the floor to Ukraine, His Excellency, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Kuleba.
Dear colleagues, the Arria meeting which we are holding today has already turned into an annual discussion of the consequences of the temporary occupation of Crimea by Russia. I am particularly grateful to Minister Liimets and the Estonian leadership in making this event possible, as well as to all co-organizers, especially those who co-sponsor such Crimean discussion for the first time. The geography of the participants and co-sponsors is expanding, and it is a clear sign that attention of the UN member states to the consequences of the temporary occupation of Crimea is growing. On the one hand, it is satisfying to see a growing number of countries sharing our concerns. On the other hand, it is truly regretful that the continuous deterioration of the situation in Crimea demands such a level of attention. Russia's armed aggression against Ukraine has caused a major crisis in international politics and undermined the authority of international organizations. It also underscored that we, the UN member states, should stay vigilant, ready, and united. We should not let the events of 2014 happen again. We should never again be taken by surprise, thinking that in modern world such gross violations of international law and human rights are impossible. These violations are possible, and they are real. It is high time that we increase the effectiveness of our joint efforts to achieve the deoccupation of Crimea. Unfortunately, back in 2014, the UN has not given a strong enough response to the beginning of the occupation of Crimea to discourage Russia from further aggression. The first meeting of the Council on the matter, which Ukraine requested in February 2014, proved Russia would not listen to the international community. In March 2014, Russia vetoed the draft resolution of the UN Security Council in support of Ukraine's territorial integrity. That same month, the Russian authorities detained, threatened, and expelled from Crimea the UN envoy Ambassador Robert Serry, who was there on official mission. The then Secretary General, obviously not expecting such a contemptuous behavior from the non-elected council member, even avoided applying Article 99 of the UN Charter and bringing Russia's aggression against Ukraine to further attention of the Council. And Russia, in its turn, responded with an even more audacious violation of the UN Charter and proceeded with the attempted annexation of Crimea. 7 years later, the Russian military presence on the peninsula has more than doubled. Other negative trends vary from changing the demographic structure of the population of Crimea and other breaches of international humanitarian law to large-scale human rights violations such as political persecution, cultural and religious suppression of Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar communities, UNESCO World Heritage Sites and cultural sites in the temporarily occupied Crimea are subjected to barbaric treatment and robbery. On numerous occasions, the UN stressed the responsibility of the Russian Federation for the abductions, torture, extrajudicial killings in the temporarily occupied Crimea, and pointed out the prevailing atmosphere of impunity for these crimes. We urge the occupying power to assume non-politicized position on the access to Crimea and allow full access in accordance with international law and in particular international humanitarian law. The long-term environmental impact of Russian activities for the peninsula and adjacent regions is yet to be assessed. Russia's disruptive policy aims to achieve legitimization of its attempted annexation, to cement the status quo and to protect its military power from Crimea throughout the Azov Black Sea region and to the Mediterranean. The international community may get accustomed to Russia's occupation of Crimea and its military aggression in Donbas. The world may turn a blind eye to the mentioned deterioration of the situation on the peninsula and in the temporarily occupied territories in Eastern Europe, and continue its relations with Russia in a business-as-usual manner. These are the worst things that may happen today. It is critically important we maintain a strong joint stance on the occupation, elaborated within the UN, the EU, and other regional and international organizations. There is no reason to revise and weaken this position. We urgently require the long-term vision and determined actions to reverse the negative consequences of the occupation of Crimea and to ensure restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity. With this in mind, Ukraine has initiated the new consultation and coordination format, the Crimea Platform. It is a flexible international mechanism to provide a long-term strategic vision of deoccupation of Crimea, to consolidate international efforts and to enhance synergy of related processes at intergovernmental, parliamentary, and expert levels. Taking this opportunity, I invite all UN member states to join this initiative. The Inaugural Summit, which is scheduled to take place in Kyiv on 23rd August 2021, will launch the Crimea platform and adopt a summary document outlining the vision for further consolidation of the Crimea deoccupation policy. I strongly encourage you to join the Crimea platform and look forward to greeting you in Kyiv. Thank you very much for your support of Ukraine, for your attention, and for participation in this important event.
Thank you, Excellency. I would like to give the floor now to Lithuania, Minister of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Mr. Landsbergis.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Thank you for organizing this meeting and for your continuous support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. As we mark 7 years since the illegal annexation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol by the Russian Federation, the position of Lithuania remains firm and consistent. We will never recognize illegal annexation of Crimea and will continue to support raising this issue in the UN and all other relevant international fora. We are committed to the policy of non-recognition, including application of restrictive measures. After all these years, Russia still desperately tries to present illegal annexation of Crimea as the alleged legitimate will of the people living in the peninsula. However, the so-called referendum was a violation of the Ukrainian constitution, general principles of international law, and is not recognized by the international community. In addition, the decision by the European Court of Human Rights on 16 December 2020 clearly dispels the myth so strongly promoted by Russia about the so-called peaceful and legitimate accession of Crimea. Decision by the court is a strong legal argument which proves the fact of the unprovoked military aggression by Russia on the territory of Ukraine in Crimea. Russia, as the member state of the Council of Europe, must implement the decision made by the court. Madam Minister, the international community needs to continue expanding its political pressure on Russia, including through sanctions, demanding its full compliance with international law and human rights standards. Moreover, we must continue to raise and condemn concrete steps by Russia of the further forced integration of the peninsula, ongoing militarization, and human rights violations. Passportization and forced conscription, military exercises, persecution, violations of rights of persons belonging to national minorities, ethnic and religious groups, particularly Crimean Tatars, politically motivated charges and convictions are extremely alarming and must cease immediately. Continued systematic suppression of the human rights, including freedom of religion or belief, freedom of opinion and expression, as well as of peaceful assembly and association, also continue to raise our deep concern. International laws guaranteeing sovereignty and territorial integrity of states could not be rewritten by force and must be respected by all members of the international community, without exception. Lithuania continues to call for the full responsibility of the Russian Federation as the occupying power for the violations of international law and human rights in Crimea. We believe that Ukraine's initiative on the International Crimean Platform will be a useful tool to consolidate international policy of non-recognition and increase pressure on Russia to prevent further reinforcement of its illegal actions in the peninsula. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. I would now like to give the floor to Canada, Minister of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Mr. Garneau.
Thank you to my colleague, Eva Maria Limets, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Estonia, for chairing today's important meeting and the briefers for your presentations. 7 years ago, Russia deployed military troops and forcibly invaded the Ukrainian peninsula. Since then, Russia has repeatedly ignored calls from the international community to reverse its decision to illegally annex and occupy Crimea, which grossly violated Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. During this period, the residents of Crimea have continued to suffer from political suppression, severe human rights abuses, and a deterioration of their environment and life conditions. As we mark this somber milestone, Canada reaffirms that we stand with the people of Ukraine who continue to fight tirelessly for their fundamental rights and freedoms. Since Russia's illegal annexation, the human rights situation on the peninsula has severely deteriorated. Targeted forms of discrimination, persecution, and forced assimilation continue to be faced by many groups in Crimea on the basis of their ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, and gender identity. The human rights of the Crimean Tatars have been particularly targeted through arbitrary detentions, arrests, torture, and forced disappearances. The Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people has been banned, an illegal and immoral decision which Canada continues to denounce. Russia has settled hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens to Crimea and continues to destroy the historical and cultural heritage of the Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar peoples. Nous demandons la protection des défenseurs des droits humains, des activistes de la société civile et des journalistes indépendants qui mettent en lumière les abus présentement en cours dans la région, et nous demandons également à la Russie de libérer tous les prisonniers politiques qui sont illégalement détenus. Nous sommes également alarmés par les efforts de la Russie qui visent à militariser la Crimée, la mer Noire et la mer d'Azov. Depuis 2014, la Russie a utilisé une conscription illégale et forcée sur plus de 28 000 résidents de la Crimée, a militarisé l'éducation des mineurs et a perturbé le commerce maritime dans la mer d'Azov via le détroit de Kerch. Aujourd'hui, le Forum nous présente une opportunité en tant que communauté internationale de renforcer notre engagement envers le peuple et le gouvernement de l'Ukraine alors qu'ils subissent l'agression continue de la Russie et de multiples violations du droit international. Canada supports Ukraine's new Crimea Platform initiative, which aims to provide a long-term vision for the deoccupation and reintegration of Crimea. Our commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and the territorial integrity is firm. We will continue to maintain pressure on Russia until Russia respects Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and international law. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. I would now like to give the floor to Germany, Minister of State, His Excellency Mr. Annen.
Madam Minister, thank you very much, Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I am from Hamburg, Germany's biggest port, a city that is open to the world. And it was therefore no coincidence that Hamburg established the first German city, twinning with the Soviet Union with Leningrad back in 1957. And we have been living that partnership ever since. Hamburg and Germany stand for reliability and we stand for partnership. We depend on rules and international law. We in Hamburg are also known for being rather straightforward and cool-headed. We call a spade a spade. Crimea, 7 years after the Russian annexation. No matter how often we debate that annexation, it remains a shocking breach of the UN Charter and international law. This change of borders by force was unprecedented in Europe since the end of the Second World War. Russia shook the foundations of peace in Europe, including the OSCE principles and, as already has been mentioned, the Budapest Memorandum. Russia added insult to injury, organizing a sham referendum that made mockery of democratic standards. The Donbass was the next target for Russia's attacks on Ukraine. And we all know until this day, Russia and its cronies in the self-styled so-called republics are responsible for the loss of lives and enormous suffering. Ladies and gentlemen, in Crimea, Russia has been violating human rights on a massive scale over the past 7 years. The freedoms of expression, of association, religion or belief, and the right to peaceful assembly being the first victims of an illegal annexation, and with the Tatar community being singled out and driven out of their homeland. Russia defies an ICJ order by banning the self-governing institution the Majlis. I urge Russia to release all Ukrainian citizens who are illegally detained and imprisoned, including more than 100% of the Tatar community. Ladies and gentlemen, Russia continues to block access to Crimea for independent international monitors by the United Nations, by the OSCE, by the Council of Europe, by NGOs. Journalists, human rights defenders, and lawyers in Crimea are under threat. In line with the European Court of Human Rights decision of January 14, 2021, I call on Russia to fully comply with international humanitarian law and international human rights standards, also by granting unimpeded access to regional and international human rights monitoring mechanism, as well as non-governmental human rights organizations to Crimea and to Sevastopol. I am further concerned about the militarization of Crimea. I urge Russia to comply with its international commitments by ensuring unhindered access to the Ukrainian ports in the Sea of Azov and the freedom of navigation. Ladies and gentlemen, as I said in the beginning, Hamburg and Germany stand for reliability and partnership. We remain open for partnership with Russia. But partnership requires reliability and the adherence also of Russia to rules and international obligations. The conclusion is clear. In line with the UN Charter, international law, and the decisions of the General Assembly, we cannot recognize Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. For Russia, the conclusion should be equally simple. Come clean about Crimea. Stop human rights abuses and return Crimea to Ukraine. Crimea is and remains Ukraine. Thank you very much, Madam Minister.
Thank you, Excellency. I would now like to give the floor to Turkey, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Mr. Köran.
Thank you very much, Excellencies, dear participants. I would like to thank organizers and co-sponsors of this timely event. I convey best regards of our Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu. We are very pleased to be among the co-sponsors of this meeting. We also supported recent side events at the OHCHR and Human Rights Council. It has been 7 years since the illegal annexation. Unfortunately, the situation in Crimea continues to threaten regional security. Therefore, it is a responsibility for the international community to keep this issue on the international agenda. We have a clear and consistent policy. Turkey strongly supports territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. We do not recognize the illegal annexation. Our approach is based on both legal and moral grounds. Our cooperation with Ukraine is improving with high-level visits and new bilateral mechanisms. As our President Recep Tayyip Erdogan underlines, Crimea is an important element of historic and humanitarian ties between our countries. All communities, including Tatars, have a right to live in peace and prosperity in their homeland. Turkey is home to more than 3 million citizens of Tatar origin. They suffered a lot throughout history. After the annexation in 2014, more than 25,000 of them had to leave their homes. The ones stayed in the Peninsula continue to face difficulties in their daily lives. Political trials and unlawful detentions against Tatars are a source of great concern. Turkey stands with Tatar people and supports to improve their living conditions. All communities in the Peninsula deserve peace, prosperity, and freedom. We must keep their demands high on the international agenda. Stronger engagement of international community is essential for resolution of the issue in line with the international law. Therefore, we strongly support the Crimean platform. We hope that this platform will increase the attention of international community on Crimea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency. I would now like to give the floor to Latvia, Minister of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Mr. Rinkevič.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thank my Estonian colleague for hosting us today. 7 years ago, Crimea and Sevastopol were occupied and illegally annexed by the Russian Federation. This violation of international law remains a direct challenge to international security and stability, causing serious implications for the international legal order. I welcome the opportunity to join international partners for this discussion. Latvia continues to stand with Ukraine. We do not and will not recognize Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. Our support to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized border is steadfast. As the situation in Crimea continues to deteriorate, I will focus on specific areas of concern. Various United Nations bodies affirm ongoing repressions, unlawful detentions, violence, and enforced disappearances. The recent detentions and accusations against Crimean civil activists are another proof that Crimean Tatars and Ukrainian-speaking communities are particularly targeted and persecuted. The human rights violations must stop, and those responsible must be held accountable. All cases of human rights violations and abuses should be thoroughly investigated. Latvia reiterates its call on Russia to grant all international human rights observers and monitoring mechanisms access to the illegally annexed territories. We are deeply alarmed by the continued demographic change of the population of Crimea. This change is realized by the Russian Federation. A measure of an occupying regime once so well known to the Baltic states. Furthermore, forcible passportization, restrictions of freedom of movement, and illegal conscription of Crimean residents in the armed forces of the Russian Federation are clear violations of international humanitarian law. The increasing militarization of the Crimean Peninsula is a threat for the security situation in the wider Black Sea region. These actions place irreversible consequences for the humanitarian and environmental situation. The United Nations resolutions calling on Russia to withdraw its military presence from Crimea must be implemented. The global community in the past 7 years has clearly shown that it stands with Ukraine and within the international law. It is demonstrated by the UN General Assembly and the International Court of Justice in particular. Latvia will continue to implement the non-recognition policy and to support Ukraine. In this regard, I welcome Ukraine's initiative to establish the Crimean platform. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Excellency. I would like to now give the floor to Czech Republic. Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Mr. Povasil.
Excellency, Madam Minister, let me thank you for convening this timely meeting and all the distinguished briefers for their comprehensive and first-hand information about the situation on the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea. First of all, I'd like to reiterate our unwavering support to sovereignty, territorial integrity, unity and independence of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. The violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity by acts of aggression and the illegal annexation of Crimea to the Russian Federation constitute grave violations of the UN Charter and the international law. They are seriously threatening the rules-based international order and international peace and security. The Czech Republic believes that the conflict must remain high on the UN agenda, including that of the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Human Rights Council, and other relevant fora. 7 years of Russian occupation of Crimean Peninsula represent 7 years of systematic human rights and fundamental freedoms abuses. We have been witnessing grave violations of the freedom of expression, religion or belief, association, as well as the right to peaceful assembly. Persecutions and systematic harassment of civil society activists, independent journalists, or just Ukrainian citizens that remain affiliated to their motherland are taking place, as well as politically motivated trials and targeted suppression of the Crimean Tatars and other national minorities. The overall trend is negative. The situation is getting worse year after year, and the COVID-19 pandemic unfortunately only catalyzes and accelerates negative trends in this regard. Under international humanitarian law, the occupation authorities are responsible for the health care of Crimean inhabitants. Yet, in fact, the authorities are very reluctant to provide adequate actions to tackle the pandemic, while misusing the situation and implementing additional restrictive measures, such as strictly limited possibilities of crossing the administrative border to the Ukrainian mainland. Political prisoners, in particular, are lacking sufficient medical assistance. We are alarmed and call for an independent, impartial, and effective investigation of all credible reports on the use of arbitrary detentions, enforced kidnappings, and torture. As one example of repression and judicial harassment of people on Crimea, I'd like to mention the name of the only woman on the long list of Crimean political prisoners, Galina Dovgopulova. She is 66 years old. She has been accused of espionage for Ukraine, detained in 2019, and currently faces up to 20 years of imprisonment. We will remain vocal about the situation of the occupied Crimea on all possible international fora, as well as during our bilateral contacts with Russia. The Czech Republic calls on the Russian Federation to stop human rights abuses on the peninsula, to release all political prisoners, to respect international law, and to end the occupation of the Ukrainian territory. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. I would now like to give the floor to Poland, Under-Secretary of State, Minister of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Mr. Buildup.
Thank you very much, distinguished ministers, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank the Foreign Minister of Estonia, Madam Eva-Maria Limets, and other co-conveners for organizing this important debate. The sheer number of co-sponsors proves that the matter of Russia's illegal invasion and annexation of Crimea remains an important concern within the Security Council Forum. As we gather here today, I'd like to express Poland's enduring commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Russia's aggression against our neighbor has been ongoing for the past 7 years and remains one of the greatest challenges to security and stability in Europe. We are concerned with Russia's military activities in Crimea, the Black Sea region, the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, which provoke tensions in the region. We urge Russia to stop the increasing militarization in the region of the Crimean Peninsula. Thousands of Russian militaries, hundreds of tanks, artillery systems, and other advanced weaponry, including nuclear-capable aircraft, have been deployed to Crimea. Since Russia's occupation of the peninsula, we have witnessed severe human rights violations and the repressive policies of occupational Russian administration. These include persecution of indigenous Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians, and also we can witness the religious discrimination. The dire pattern of enforced disappearance, ill treatment, and unlawful detentions of Crimean residents have become a dramatic reality of the peninsula since 2014. The de facto authorities violate fundamental freedoms and suppress independent media. Poland highly appreciates the activity of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission and the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission. We constantly reiterate a need for this international presence and its freedom of movement across the whole territory of Ukraine. Poland sees the Crimean platform as a valuable initiative with the potential to raise awareness and increased visibility of the illegal annexation of Crimea and its intensive militarization by Russia. We believe that it is particularly important to guarantee that the platform will contribute to concrete decision-making processes on the international fora. Ladies and gentlemen, under international law, all states have a duty not to accept serious breaches of obligations arising under peremptory norms such as prohibition of aggression. Therefore, non-recognition of Crimea as a part of the Russian Federation is not a matter of political decision or approach. It is a legal requirement. Concluding, let me stress our unwavering support for the people of Ukraine, its territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence. Poland does not and will not recognize Russia's annexation of Crimea. Crimea is Ukraine. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Excellency. I would now like to give the floor to Netherlands Minister of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Mr. Blok.
Thank you, Eva Maria. Thank you for hosting us today. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank the briefers of today, and please allow me to focus on three aspects. First of all, Crimea's illegal annexation is an unacceptable violation of international law. Second, the current militarization and human rights violations worsen the situation. And third, we can never accept the current situation in Crimea to be the new normal. First, the illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia clearly is an unacceptable violation of international law. It constitutes a flagrant breach of the fundamental norm set out in Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter on the prohibition of the use of force. And it's also a clear violation of the principle of non-intervention in the internal affairs of other states. There can be no place for the use of force and coercion to change borders in Europe in the 21st century. The Netherlands reaffirms its commitment to the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. In this context, let me highlight the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, to which the Russian Federation was one of the signatories. The so-called referendum of the 16th of March 2014 does not constitute any legal basis to change the status of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea as legitimate part of Ukraine. This illegal vote contradicts the Constitution of Ukraine and was not authorized by the government of Ukraine. Second, the current increase in military presence on the peninsula and human rights violations worsen the situation. We see an increased military buildup by the Russian Federation, which goes hand in hand with expansion of air, army, and navy bases in Crimea. And we are also concerned about Russian military exercises which do not meet internationally agreed transparency standards. And this leads to a deterioration in the security situation in the broader Black Sea region. The human rights situation on the Ukrainian peninsula has deteriorated significantly since its illegal annexation by the Russian Federation. We are concerned about developments described in the OHCHR reports. The population faces an extremely intimidating climate due to severe restrictions on their fundamental rights and freedoms. And this holds especially true for Crimean Tatars. And the Netherlands urges the Russian Federation to uphold both its obligations under applicable law as an occupying power and its international human rights commitments, and to ensure proper and unimpeded access of international human rights monitoring missions and human rights NGOs to Crimea. Third, we cannot allow the current situation in Crimea to be accepted as the new normal. Let me recall that the UN General Assembly Resolution 68-262, adopted in 2014 by a large majority, calls upon all states, international organizations, and specialized agencies not to recognize any alteration of the status of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, as well as to refrain from any action or dealing that might be interpreted as recognizing any such altered status. 7 years later, as the illegal annexation continues, this resolution remains as relevant as it was the day it was adopted. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. I would now like to give the floor to Slovakia, State Secretary, Minister of Foreign Affairs and European Affairs, Her Excellency, Mr. Brodskova. Please unmute your microphone. I suggest that we continue with the United States Permanent Representative, Her Excellency Ms. Thomas Greenfield.
Thank you very much. Foreign Minister Lemets, thank you for hosting, and thank you to Estonia for organizing today's event. And to the briefers, your statements today have shed light on many issues that require Security Council attention. I'm encouraged by the number of members who are participating in today's discussion. Your participation is a powerful demonstration that 7 years after Russia's invasion of Crimea, the international community still supports the bedrock principle in the UN Charter. No country can change the borders of another one by force. As President Biden said last month, when Russia invaded its neighbors, it did not just violate another country's sovereignty and territorial integrity, it violated international law and the very norms by which modern countries engage with one another. Russia wants us to believe that its invasion of Crimea was justified and provoked, but we will not be fooled. Here's the truth. After protests brought an end to the corrupt Yanukovych regime, Moscow took revenge against Ukraine for its decision to chart a path toward democratic reform. In February 2014, Russia's little green men, armed with Russian weaponry, took over the Crimea Peninsula. In March, Russian agitators seized buildings and fueled the bloody Donbas conflict that has claimed more than 13,000 lives to date. This is how Russia's campaign to undermine and destabilize Ukraine began. Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine is not, as Russia claims, an internal Ukrainian conflict. Russia funds, arms, trains, leads, and fights alongside its proxy forces and armed groups in eastern Ukraine. Its invasion of Crimea was followed by a series of killings and the disappearances of at least a dozen opponents of the occupation. These actions remain unresolved and they need to be investigated. And we urge Russia to release the more than 100 Ukrainian political prisoners it is holding. These political prisoners are only one part of the human cost of Russia's occupation. Occupation authorities have sustained a brutal campaign of repression against Crimean Tatars, ethnic Ukrainians, and members of other minority ethnic and religious groups. Occupation authorities have raided mosques and homes, driven independent media off the peninsula, and handed down lengthy prison sentences to those with the bravery to speak out. Furthermore, Russia's occupation and militarization of the peninsula have implications far beyond Ukraine's borders. Russia has moved nuclear-capable aircraft, missiles, weapons, and ammunition into the peninsula and has increased its military presence in the Black Sea, the Sea of Azov, and the Kerch Strait. This is a threat to the world's common security. We already know what Russia will say in response to these truths. It will accuse Kiev of a litany of abuses against its population and claim the OSCE has not confirmed the presence of its military forces in eastern Ukraine. But Russia refuses to allow OSCE and UN monitors to access occupied Crimea. It obstructs and harasses the OSCE monitoring team in Donetsk and Luhansk. Also, it can continue to push its false narrative. So if Russia wants the international community to believe its narrative and is truly concerned about the welfare of the people living in Crimea and Donbass, it should allow humanitarian workers and OSCE and UN envoys immediate access to these areas. I ask all of those gathered here today to join us in calling on Russia to grant this access. The United States welcomes Ukraine's new initiative, the Crimea Platform, as the next step and venue for international partners committed to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. It's time to end Russia's occupation of Crimea and its ongoing aggression in eastern Ukraine. We look forward to continuing our work with Ukraine, our allies, our partners, to do just that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency. Now I would like to give the floor to France, Permanent Representative, His Excellency, Mr. Riviere.
Madam Chair, Ministers, dear colleagues, let me first thank the panelists for their useful first-hand accounts of the situation in Crimea. It has now been 7 years since we witnessed the illegal annexation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol by Russia. Russia has thereby blatantly violated the principles and objectives enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations and OSCE principles and commitments. We once again call on Russia to abide by its international obligations and commitments and respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We reaffirm our support for the European Union policy of non-recognition of the annexation. The continued militarization of the peninsula is a source of concern. It has implications for the security of the Black Sea region and of the neighboring countries. We call on Russia to guarantee the freedom of navigation of all vessels in a Kerch Strait in accordance with international law. Illegal restrictions on ships passing through exacerbate tensions with negative consequences for Ukrainian ports in the Sea of Azov and for the entire region. We also call on Russia to take steps to improve the environmental situation in Crimea, which has deteriorated significantly. The illegal annexation of Crimea has led to serious and repeated human rights violations, extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detentions, abductions, enforced disappearances and discrimination, including on the basis of religion or belief. We deplore the continuous systematic persecution of Crimean Tatars and persons belonging to Ukrainian-speaking communities. We call on Russia to put an end to this policy, which is clearly aimed at silencing those who dare to denounce the annexation of Crimea. Those responsible for these violations must be brought to justice. Russia must also stop its policy of demographic change in the peninsula. In this regard, I would like to ask the Russian delegation when we can expect Russia to finally grant regional and international human rights monitoring mechanism, in particular the human rights monitoring mission in Ukraine, safe and unfettered access to Crimea as requested by the Assembly General resolutions. Let me use this opportunity to recall the effort carried out by France together with Germany in a framework of the Normandy format to build a just and lasting peace in eastern Ukraine and to restore full Ukrainian sovereignty over the Donbass. We renew our call to the Russian and Ukrainian sides to make progress in the full implementation of the Minsk agreements in accordance with the conclusions of the Paris Summit in December 2019. We do not accept Russia's rhetoric of blaming Ukraine alone for the deadlock. We call on Russia to take its responsibilities and to make use of the influence it has on the de facto representatives of the areas not controlled by the Ukrainian government. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Excellency. I would now like to give the floor to Ireland Permanent Representative, Her Excellency, Ms. Byrne-Nason.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister. I want to express my appreciation also to our briefers this morning, and in particular to Mr. Medemenov for his courage and his work on the ground in Crimea. Minister, I also want to say at the outset that Ireland strongly supports Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as diplomatic efforts to achieve this. In this regard, we underline the importance of respect for and the timely implementation of judicial decisions. In line with our respect for the fundamental principles of international law, Ireland does not recognise the illegal annexation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. We've heard today, Minister, of the deeply worrying human rights situation in the Crimean Peninsula. Residents of the peninsula faced restrictions of their human rights and their fundamental freedoms, such as rights to freedom of expression, religion, belief and association, and the right to peaceful assembly. The situation of Crimean Tatars is of particular concern. They, along with Ukrainians and all ethnic and religious minorities in the peninsula, must be allowed to maintain their identities and traditions. Likewise, we call for the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in conflict resolution efforts on the peninsula. Journalists like Mr. Medemenov, other media workers, human rights defenders, and defense lawyers must be able to work independently and without undue interference and intimidation. Ireland welcomes the valuable work being done by Ukrainian human rights organisations. It's crucial that the regional and international human rights monitoring mechanisms, as well as the non-governmental human rights organisations, have unimpeded access to the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and city of Sevastopol. Ireland calls for the immediate release of all imprisoned human rights defenders and of Ukrainian citizens in Crimea who have been illegally detained and sentenced in breach of international law. We call for reports of human rights violations and abuses, such as enforced disappearances and torture, to be fully investigated. There can be no impunity for violations of human rights. Minister, we are deeply disturbed that the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission freedom of movement continues to be restricted and that this mission's equipment has been damaged or interfered with. Let me recall that all the signatories of the Minsk Agreement agreed on the need for the special monitoring mission's safe and secure access to the entire territory of Ukraine. We call on the Russian Federation to stop changing the demographic structure in Crimea through resettlement of its own civilian population to the peninsula. Furthermore, Ireland stresses that under international humanitarian law, the population in Crimea cannot be compelled to serve in the Russian armed or auxiliary forces, nor be subjected to forced transfer or deportation. We underline that militarization of the Crimean Peninsula continues to have a negative impact on the security situation in the Black Sea region and beyond. We call on Russia to refrain from impeding the lawful exercise of navigational rights and freedoms to and from the Sea of Azov in accordance with international law and for peace and prosperity in the region. Finally, Minister, like others, we also recognise the significant economic toll this conflict has had on people in the region, including the most vulnerable members of the society. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Excellency. I would now like to give the floor to United Kingdom Permanent Representative, Her Excellency Mr. Woodward.
Thank you, Your Excellency Eva-Maria Liimets, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Estonia, for leading and chairing today's important discussion. And thank you to our briefers for their insights and their impactful statements. The United Kingdom joins you in strongly condemning Russian aggression against Ukraine and reiterates our unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We do not and will not recognize Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. Russia's military operation to illegally seize 10,000 square miles of Ukrainian territory broke the first principle of international law, that countries may not acquire territory or change borders by force. Not only did Russia disregard the UN Charter, it flagrantly violated a number of bilateral and multilateral agreements and commitments, including the Helsinki Final Act and the Budapest Memorandum. Following the illegal annexation of Crimea, life on the peninsula changed drastically. Ethnic and religious groups, including Crimean Tatars, had their fundamental freedoms restricted and have faced widespread persecution. Russian de facto authorities have raided Tatar homes and mosques. They have detained imams and fined individuals for possessing Islamic texts, which is banned under Russian extremism law. House raids and arbitrary detentions are a regular occurrence, together with unfair trials and the torture of political prisoners. Over 100 political prisoners, Ukrainian political prisoners, remain in detention in Russia and Crimea, including Oleg Prihodko, a Ukrainian activist from Crimea, who was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment on the 3rd of March, based on a fabricated case with no factual evidence of his having committed a crime. We call on Russia to release all illegally detained political prisoners. And we call on Russia to grant access to international human rights monitoring missions in line with UN General Assembly Resolution 75/192. We will continue to work closely with the UN and international partners to ensure the perpetrators of human rights abuses and violations are held to account. The UK also condemns Russia's ongoing militarization of Crimea, the Sea of Azov, and the Black Sea. Since 2015, Russia has conscripted 28,000 residents of Crimea. They have stationed at least 32,500 military personnel in Crimea and deployed advanced weaponry and missile warning systems there. Russia's military exercises in the Black Sea are not only destabilizing regional security, but also have a significant economic impact. Russian ships are intentionally obstructing traffic and violating the right of passage. Every day, commercial vehicles are harassed. In closing, Your Excellency, I would like to underline UK support for the new international Crimean platform, which will bring together the international community to support the return of Crimea to Ukraine. We must respond robustly against hostile acts that violate the UN Charter and international law, and continue to keep Crimea in the spotlight. Crimea is Ukraine. Thank you, Your Excellency.
Thank you, Excellency. I would now like to give the floor to Norway, Deputy Permanent Representative, Her Excellency Mr. Heimerback.
Thank you, Minister. Excellencies, colleagues, March 18 marks the 7th anniversary of Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, a blatant violation of international law. We condemn Russia's illegal annexation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol and call on Russia to reverse this act. Norway reiterates its strong support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, including the Crimean Peninsula and adjoining territorial waters. Let me highlight 3 issues in addition to the Nordic statement that will be delivered later. First, Norway is concerned about the deteriorating human rights situation in Crimea, as documented by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, including arbitrary persecutions, detentions, and forced disappearances and forced conscription. Any dissenting voices appear to be at risk, whether they belong to journalists, human rights defenders, civil society actors, or others, with Crimean Tatars and Ukrainian being particularly targeted. We stress that regional and international human rights monitoring mechanism must be given unimpeded access to Crimea. Non-governmental human rights organizations must be permitted to operate. Second, linguistic and cultural rights, as well as religious freedoms, must be protected. We call for the restoration of the Majlis of the Crimean Tatars as ordered by the ICC. And third, Norway condemns the ongoing militarization of the Crimean Peninsula and the presence of Russian troops on Ukrainian territory. We are concerned by Russia's military activities in Crimea, as well as the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. It exacerbates tensions in the region and impedes lawful navigational rights and freedoms. Excellencies, the Russian Federation continues to violate the Helsinki Final Act and fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter. Norway does not and will not recognize Russia's purported annexation of Crimea. We join our European and other partners in affirming that our non-recognition policy and restrictive measures against Russia will remain in place until Russia fully reverses its illegal annexation of Crimea. We welcome this meeting and other initiatives aimed at keeping Russia's occupation and illegal annexation of Crimea high on the international agenda. I thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Excellency. I would now like to give the floor to Georgia, Permanent Representative, His Excellency Mr. Ilze.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Firstly, let me say that we are proud to be joining you as co-sponsor of today's event on such a pressing issue 7 years into Russian aggression against its sovereign neighbor and attempted annexation of Ukraine's inalienable part, the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, and the city of Sevastopol. I also would like to thank the briefers for their sobering accounts of the situation on the ground. Respect of territorial integrity of states and the prohibition of threats or use of force are fundamental principles of the international law enshrined in the UN Charter and the Helsinki Final Act. By violating these principles, Russia not only endangers Ukraine, but also undermines peace and security in Europe. That is why it is so critical that Ukraine remains high on the international agenda, and thus we welcome the timely Ukrainian initiative to launch the consultation and coordination format, the Crimean platform, which will provide a strategic vision to the process of the deoccupation of Crimea. 7 years after Russia's attempted annexation of Ukraine's Crimea, the militarization of the Crimean Peninsula poses increasing security and hybrid threats not only to the Azov and Black Sea region, but to the whole of Europe. We condemn Russia's aggressive actions in the Black Sea region, including the practice of blocking Ukrainian ports and large areas of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, using hybrid methods under a pretext of military exercises. Thus, unlawful practice must cease and be brought in conformity with international maritime law. Meanwhile, the severe humanitarian and human rights situation on the ground is further deteriorating, as reflected in the reports of the UN Secretary General, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and other international organizations. It is distressing that local population lives under constant threat of arbitrary detentions, politically motivated convictions targeting Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians, torture and ill treatment, forced transfers, and violations of their fair trial rights. The fundamental rights and freedoms of those living under Russian occupation are being continuously curtailed. This particularly relates to the freedom of opinion, expression and association, freedom of thought, conscience and religion, and freedom of the media. People are deprived of civil and property rights through forced passportization and conscription to the Russian army of the residents in the occupied Crimea, in breach of international law. The list of grave human rights violations unfortunately goes too long. We're deeply concerned that in the face of deteriorating human rights and humanitarian situation, the international human rights monitoring mechanisms are denied access to the temporarily Russia-occupied territories of Ukraine, even amidst the pandemic. We reiterate our call for full, unimpeded, and immediate access to the OHCHR and other international human rights monitoring mechanisms to the occupied territories of Ukraine. Against this backdrop, we welcome that Ukraine continues to seek justice through international legal instruments, and in this regard, we note that on the 14th of January this year, the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights ruled on the admissibility of an interstate claims in Ukraine's case against the Russian Federation regarding a concerning pattern of human rights violations in Crimea. Dear colleagues, we once again strongly condemn Russia's ongoing illegal occupation and the attempted annexation of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, and confirm unequivocal support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized state borders, including its territorial waters. We do not, nor will ever, recognize Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. Crimea is Ukraine. We call on other states to do the same. And in conclusion, let me underline that the consequences of Russia's occupation policy, be it in Georgia or Ukraine, cannot be effectively addressed without the strong international pressure. Joint international response must be applied and pressure that Russia returns to the framework of the international law and starts implementing its commitments, including the Minsk Agreement and the EU-mediated 12 of August 2008 ceasefire agreement. I thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. I would now like to give the floor to Australia, Permanent Representative, His Excellency Mr. Fifield.
Thank you, Minister. Colleagues, this year marks 7 years since Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. It's critical this Council continues to focus on the situation in Ukraine and ongoing violations of international law there. As we mark this bleak milestone, Australia reiterates its full and unequivocal commitment to supporting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Australia reinforces this commitment with robust sanctions, including targeted financial sanctions and travel bans on individuals and entities responsible for or complicit in undermining Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in Crimea and Sevastopol. We're also concerned by the Russian Federation's efforts to militarise Crimea and to undermine regional stability. Australia deplores Russia's suppression of human rights in Crimea, including arbitrary detentions, arrests, torture and forced disappearances. In particular, Crimean Tatars have been viciously targeted. We strongly condemn the limitations on freedom of religion and belief and freedom of expression and association. Australia welcomes the European Court of Human Rights decision to proceed with Ukraine's case regarding human rights violations committed by Russia in Crimea. We also welcome the December 2020 announcement by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to request authorisation to open an investigation into possible war crimes and crimes against humanity committed on Ukraine's territory from 2014 onwards. Sadly, this year will also mark 7 years since the tragic downing of MH17, which killed 38 people who called Australia home. Australia's determination to establish the truth of the circumstances surrounding the downing of MH17 will not wane. We will continue to reiterate calls for Russia to rejoin trilateral state responsibility talks. We also note Ukraine's case in the European Court of Human Rights, joined with that of the Netherlands regarding the conflict in eastern Ukraine and the downing of MH17. Finally, colleagues, we call on Russia to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognised borders, including its territorial waters. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Excellency. I would now like to give the floor to Belgium Permanent Representative, His Excellency Mr. Kridelka.
Thank you, Madam Minister. I would like first of all to thank our fellow EU member state Estonia for taking the initiative to organize this important Arria-formula meeting. I also thank the briefers for their detailed and sobering comments. 7 years have passed since the illegal annexation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. 7 years during which the most fundamental norms of our international rules-based order continue to be blatantly disregarded. Today, I would like to reiterate Belgium's steadfast commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, including its territorial waters. Together with our European partners, we will continue to condemn this violation of international law and implement our EU's non-recognition policy. Like others before me, Belgium is deeply concerned about the increasing militarization of the peninsula, which risks destabilizing the security situation in the Black Sea region. We call on Russia to respect its obligations under international humanitarian law, including by ceasing its attempts to change the demographic structure of the peninsula. We further call on Russia to ensure unhindered and free passage of all ships through the Kehris Strait to and from the Azov Sea, in accordance with international law. Illegal restrictions to such passage have negative economic consequences for Ukraine's ports in the Azov Sea, as well as for the region as a whole. As we have heard from ASG Brands Kehris, Crimeans continue to face multiple human rights violations and abuses. We are particularly concerned about the impact on minorities, such as the Crimean Tatars, as well as on journalists, human rights defenders, and defense lawyers. All violations and abuses of human rights should be investigated in a thorough, impartial, and independent manner. The decision of the European Court of Human Rights on 14th of January 2021 constitutes an important step towards ensuring accountability. We further call for full and unimpeded access of regional and international human rights monitoring mechanisms, as well as non-governmental human rights organizations to Crimea and Sevastopol, in accordance with UN General Assembly Resolution 75-192. In conclusion, let me underline once more that the illegal annexation of Crimea constitutes a grave breach of international law and of the fundamental norms that underpin our organization. It is the duty of the international community to continue to denounce this act. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Excellency. I would now like to give the floor to Slovakia Permanent Representative, His Excellency Mr. Mlinar.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Madam Minister. Many thanks for convening this important meeting as we mark such a grim anniversary 7 years since the occupation of Crimea by the Russian Federation. And sincere apologies for some unexpected technical difficulties on the side of my State Secretary, Madame Brodskova. I am pleased to deliver the remarks on her behalf, and Slovakia has very eagerly joined this initiative of yours as a co-sponsor. Less than a month ago, our Minister of Foreign and European Affairs visited Kiev and reiterated Slovakia's support for the political sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, including Ukraine's absolute right to have full access to the Sea of Azov as enshrined in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. I will repeat it once again. Slovakia has not recognized and will not recognize the illegal annexation of Crimea. It is a clear violation of international law that cannot be allowed to stand without a response. We fully support Ukraine's diplomatic and legal efforts aimed at restoring its sovereignty and territorial integrity. I would like to highlight 3 issues of particular concern to Slovakia. First, militarization. The ongoing Russian militarization of Crimea and the military activities of the occupying power on and around the peninsula are jeopardizing security in the entire Black Sea region and well beyond. Transfers of weapon systems, ammunition, and military personnel, as well as the ongoing reconstruction of the military infrastructure, are of utmost concern. This gray zone, inaccessible of verification or inspection activities, erodes military transparency, predictability, and trust in the region. Everyone needs to respect its obligations under the UN Charter and the international law regarding its legal responsibility for the occupied territory. My second point is about the dire human rights situation that has continued to deteriorate since 2014. Systematic restrictions of human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the rights of freedom of expression, religion or belief, and association, and the right to peaceful assembly, are of dire concern and must stop immediately. It is critically important that the regional and international human rights monitoring mechanisms, as well as the non-governmental human rights organizations and journalists, have unimpeded access to the peninsula. I would also like to emphasize the human rights of the Crimean Tatars, who are particularly targeted, and many Crimean human rights defenders that are unlawfully detained. We call for their immediate release. Last but not least, I'd like to highlight a few issues that separately can seem minor, but together may have long-standing detrimental effect on Crimea. I'm talking about population transfers, military education of children, forced conscriptions and religious restrictions, including against the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, among others. All these measures are systematically planned and implemented by the Russian Federation, and many of those are prohibited for the occupying power under international humanitarian law. Madam Chair, 7 years into its occupation, the situation in Crimea is worse in all regards, and it is of paramount importance to keep it high on the international agenda. We urge the Russian Federation as the occupying power to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw its military forces from Crimea and to end its military occupation of the territory of Ukraine without delay. I thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. I would now like to give the floor to Italy, Deputy Permanent Representative, His Excellency Mr. Stefanile.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In line with UN General Assembly Resolution 68/262, Italy reaffirms its condemnation of the illegal annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, which remains a challenge to the international legal order, and its non-recognition of such acts. We will continue to stand in solidarity with Ukraine, reiterating our unwavering support for its sovereignty, territorial integrity, unity, and independence. As a staunch supporter of effective multilateralism, Italy, together with its partners, will also keep raising concerns over the situation in the peninsula in relevant international fora. We remain deeply and specifically concerned about the human rights situation in Crimea, in light of its significant deterioration due to reported systematic restrictions of fundamental freedoms and of minority rights. We remain also seriously concerned about the conditions of the local population, which continues to bear the heaviest burden. We call for the full respect of international humanitarian and human rights law in the Crimean Peninsula, in line with the pertinent General Assembly resolutions, which Italy supported and co-sponsored. We also maintain that all human rights violations must be duly investigated and that human rights actors, including international observer missions and monitoring mechanisms, should be granted full and unhindered access to the peninsula. As we are entering the 7th year of conflict in eastern Ukraine, we welcome the general holding of the ceasefire, and we encourage the sides to commit to it in order to ensure a conducive environment for negotiations. On that note, we reaffirm our strong support for the ongoing efforts being made within existing formats to advance the implementation of the Minsk agreements, namely within the Normandy format and the Trilateral Contact Group. We once again call on all sides to uphold their commitments under the Minsk agreements and constructively engage at the negotiating table to that effect as the only way towards a sustainable and peaceful solution. In conclusion, we would like to renew our full solidarity to Ukraine and reiterate our pledge to remain engaged together with our partners on this highly important and sensitive issue. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Excellency. I would now like to give the floor to Costa Rica Deputy Permanent Representative, Her Excellency Ms. Jean Valverde.
Excellency, Costa Rica joined others in thanking the speakers for their presentations and welcomed this opportunity to learn firsthand about the situation on the ground. In this regard, please allow me to stress 3 important points. First, the annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation has brought new threats to the environment, peace, and security in the region. Lack of proper environmental governance in Crimea in regards to heavy industrial facilities has resulted in the exposure of local civilians to toxic and chemical substances and has also affected local soil and water sources. If not addressed, this could pose serious health and environmental risks to nearby communities and their livelihoods. Moreover, civilians are not facing the hardships of the dispute over water security for health, livelihoods, and production. Under international humanitarian law and human rights law, all states are bound to respect, protect, and fulfill the human right to water of their inhabitants, and Crimea is not the exception. Second, the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, including bombs, rockets, and artillery shells, especially in the city of Sevastopol, presents a significant risk to civilian populations. All parties to conflict should avoid the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas and clear contaminated regions of explosive remnants of war. Collecting data on civilian harm, including data on civilian casualties disaggregated by sex, age, and disability, and data on explosive weapons use, including locations, types, and quantities, is needed. Third, accusations against the Russian Federation appear to be firmly supported by its violations of the Minsk agreements, the Paris Charter, international humanitarian law, the Helsinki Accords, law of the sea, and the law of occupation. During this turbulent time, it's unfortunately you starting to feel like commitments to multilateralism are too much to ask for. The Russian Federation must be held to the highest standards of the international diplomacy as a permanent member of the Security Council. Excellency, fait accompli may impose realities on the ground, but those realities do not make law or create legitimate rights. Costa Rica firmly believes that the only way forward is through political dialogue and the full implementation of the Minsk agreements. We also regret that the Security Council has not been able to support the OHCHR efforts to bring peace to Ukraine through concrete political actions. I thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. I would now like to give the floor to Bulgaria, Permanent Representative, Her Excellency Ms. Toyeva.
Thank you, Madam Minister. I would like to thank the organizers of this important meeting, which Bulgaria is happy to have co-sponsored, as well as the briefers for their insightful statements. Madam Chair, Bulgaria reiterates its unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, including its maritime waters, affirmed as well by UNGA Resolution 68/262. We reaffirm our consistent position of non-recognition of the illegal annexation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol by Russia that started 7 years ago. We will continue to strictly adhere to the European Union's policy in this regard, including by implementing all EU restrictive measures. The deteriorating humanitarian situation and the ongoing human rights violations and abuses on the Crimean Peninsula and in areas in eastern Ukraine, which are not under the control of the Ukrainian government, are deeply alarming. We support the call of the international community for the immediate release of all illegally detained Ukrainian citizens, including Crimean Tatar activists imprisoned in Russia and in the illegally annexed Crimea and Sevastopol. In that respect, Bulgaria also underlines the importance of ensuring extensive, secure, and unhindered access for human rights observers and humanitarian actors throughout the entire territory of Ukraine, including in Crimea and Sevastopol. Madam Chair, as a Black Sea littoral country, we are greatly concerned about the growing militarization of the Crimean Peninsula, which has a severe negative impact on the security situation in the Black Sea region and beyond. We expect Russia to ensure unhindered and free passage to and from the Sea of Azov in accordance with the international law obligations. In a broader regional context, the unresolved conflicts represent an obstacle to the full use of traditional forms of regional naval security cooperation and confidence-building measures. An illustration of that is the limited coastal access of Georgia and Ukraine caused by Russia's military activities that prevents the finding of a common ground between all stakeholders. Under these circumstances, Bulgaria strives to keep open the possibility for active participation of the EU and NATO in the policies and mechanisms of security cooperation in the Black Sea region. In conclusion, we believe that the security situation in Ukraine and in the Black Sea region can be improved through constructive commitment of all involved parties and through strict abiding by the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, OSCE commitments, and the principle of freedom of international navigation. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me now to make a statement in my national capacity. As many today have already said, the situation in Crimea continues to deteriorate. The Russian Federation has unlawfully imposed its laws and justice system there and is conducting a severe crackdown on civil society and political opponents. The normal freedom of movement between Crimea and the rest of Ukraine has been hampered. The military buildup on the peninsula has deteriorated the overall security situation in the Black Sea region and beyond. First, on human rights. International human rights law continues to be seriously violated in Crimea. The occupying authorities want to destroy the remains of civic activism in Crimea. For that purpose, they use persecution and other forms of repression. Over 100 Crimeans are currently being held on politically motivated charges in Russian prisons. Only last week, a pro-Ukrainian activist from Crimea was sentenced to 5 years in prison by military court in Russia. 62 years old Oleg Prihodko is an ordinary man who did not accept the Russian invasion and takeover of the peninsula. We reiterate our call on Russia to release all political prisoners without delay. Despite the order of the International Court of Justice and calls by numerous UN General Assembly resolutions, the measures of Crimean Tatar people remain banned. We call on Russia to abide by its international obligations. We are deeply concerned that independent journalism on the peninsula is practically non-existent. This affects most the Crimean Tatar and Ukrainian communities, their right to information and their right to preserve their culture and identity. Many journalists fled Crimea to escape harassment, violence, and arrests. We are also worried about education and language rights. School textbooks have been rewritten to falsely emphasize that Crimea has always been part of Russia. The number of children receiving education in Ukrainian has decreased by 54 times. Military preparation classes have become compulsory for students. In addition, we see deprivation of civil and property rights through forced passportization and conscription. Russia has adopted a presidential decree whereby non-Russian citizens of Crimea and Sevastopol cannot own land in certain regions. The decree will come into force next week. Second, the freedom of movement has been severely restricted. The residents of Crimea who have refused to take Russian passport are considered foreigners. If they decide to travel to other parts of Ukraine, the Russian authorities deny them to re-entry. This is particularly cynical at the time of the COVID pandemic, where the already strained medical care system in Crimea is unable to cope with the high number of COVID patients. Third, the increased presence of Russian troops in Crimea has turned the peninsula and its nearby waters into a mighty military outspot in the Azov Black Sea region. This massive militarization is destroying the natural and cultural heritage of the peninsula, and it has a negative impact on Ukraine's economic development. Russia also restricts the freedom of navigation in the Sea of Azov, closing selecting areas under its control on the pretext of military exercises. It conducts numerous costly and time-consuming inspections of merchant ships sailing to the Ukrainian ports of Mariupol and Berdyansk. These actions on land and sea undermine the principles of post-war security order of Europe. They run against international law, including the UN Charter and the Helsinki Final Act. Estonia welcomes the Ukrainian initiative of the International Crimean Platform. This helps to consolidate the international response with the aim of eventual de-occupation of Crimea. Finally, I would like to express our wholehearted support for Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, and others whose livelihoods have been adversely impacted by Russia's aggression. We strongly condemn this and urge Russia to stop persecution, to free all political prisoners, to comply with international law, and to withdraw its military forces and equipment from the peninsula. Thank you. Now, I am glad to hand over to our Deputy Foreign Minister, Mr. Rein Tammsaar, who will continue to moderate the meeting.
Allow me now to invite the representatives of the Security Council to take the floor. I would now like to give the floor to India, His Excellency, Deputy Permanent Representative, Mr. R. Ravindra, please.
Mr. President, I thank all the co-hosts for organizing this meeting. Allow me to also place on record our reservations on this format of the meeting. My intervention will be a short one, bearing in mind the political sensitivities concerning today's topic. India has advocated political and diplomatic solutions that protect the legitimate interests of all countries in the region and ensure a long-term peace and stability in Europe and beyond. The path forward can only be through peaceful dialogue for a lasting solution acceptable to all concerned. I wish to clarify that India's relations with countries in the region stand on their own merit. They are not affected by any individual issue or crisis or external factors. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Russia. First Deputy Permanent Representative, His Excellency Mr. Polyansky. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do you hear me? It's okay? Thank you. Our Ukrainian and Western colleagues, who represent 99% of the speakers at today's event, are persisting in promoting fake news and data about Crimea and in blocking any voice that could question or put in doubt these allegations. During previous editions of this Arria-formula, I already compared it to a seminar of fiction writers who compete in making up the most thrilling story about horrors of life in Crimea. As for any gathering of such kind, there is no requirement for such a story to have any relation to the situation on the ground. We noticed that you changed the composition of this fiction club, but one thing remains consistent. Your briefers have no relations to today's Crimea and haven't visited the peninsula since its reunification with Russia. Mr. Mehmed Aminov, who is convicted for promotion of terrorist organization Hizb ut-Tahrir, being banned in Russia and in a lot of countries, including some of co-hosts of today's event, can hardly be considered an unbiased and trustworthy witness of today's realities in Crimea. Therefore, your briefers' sources of information are Ukraine-based exiled Crimean politicians, people who broke the law and have affiliation with international terrorists like Mr. Mehmed Aminov, and NGOs affiliated to exiled Crimeans or to Maidan authorities in Kiev. Since our meetings in Arria-formulas are not supposed to be fiction writers' discussion clubs, we made an effort to correct the fictional character of our today's gathering. Last year, the briefers we proposed were denied a chance to participate under the pretext that we allegedly announced them too late. This year, we proposed, very much in anticipation of the initiative of our Estonian colleagues, to include residents of Crimea into the list of the briefers well in advance. Unfortunately, our offer was ignored, clearly proving one more time that the organizers are not interested in discovering the truth about life in Crimea, or even in holding a discussion with the participation of those who live there. The refusal of our Estonian colleagues and other co-hosts and their fear to face Crimeans at this event is understandable. Opinions and accounts of people living normal life in the peninsula would absolutely not fit in their preset narrative about alleged Russian annexation, militarization, human rights abuses, discrimination of national minorities, etc. It must be very uncomfortable to spread disinformation in front of those who can easily refute these allegations and deprive this gathering of the only added value for our Western and Ukrainian colleagues, to create an impression of Russia being isolated and condemned by most of the speakers. You can achieve this only by having all speakers like-minded and streamlined alongside with well-known Western hostile approaches towards Russia. I myself will not waste time arguing with you and rebuffing your claims. Crimeans are much better placed for that. Therefore, I would simply announce that given the fact that the organizers opted to ignore our request to make a single meeting with a balanced composition of briefers, we have no other option but to organize a follow-up meeting on 17th of March. On that day, Director of Crimean Pedagogical and Engineering University, Mr. Yakubov, together with students and some invited guests, will address claims and allegations about Crimea that are being made and were made today. Since I appeared in front of you today, despite my firm rejection of your allegations and claims, I encourage all of you to have the courage and show up at our VTC Arria on 17th of March and engage in a dialogue with the residents of Crimea. They will be prepared to listen to you and answer your questions. An open-minded person will be able to make his own opinion and compare it with what was pronounced today. What I heard today is light years apart from the truth and reality. To conclude, I want to reassure you that I would advise everybody who comes to Crimea to get acquainted with the claims and ridiculous allegations that were pronounced today, just to see how far from reality and irrelevant they are. Some of them are really pathetic. To claim that we don't let anyone visit Crimea, while 7 million tourists come to spend vacations there annually, including 1 million from Ukraine, is to contradict basic common sense. I understand the emotions of our Ukrainian neighbors, but I can't say that I sympathize with them. Ukraine lost Crimea through its own mistakes, committed immediately after the Maidan coup, within the general context of alienating Russian-speaking population and neglecting their rights and aspirations. Unfortunately, this context hasn't changed, and now Ukraine is risking to lose Donbass too, through more and more alienating its residents. Ukraine is also heating up deep-rooted internal tensions within its own society by banning Russian language, opposition media, presenting Nazi collaborators as heroes, and emboldening nationalists and radicals. This is a suicidal path, and our Western colleagues are to a large extent to blame for this ongoing tragedy. Turning a blind eye on the atmosphere of impunity, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, violation of basic human rights in Ukraine is a coward act from all of you and a blatant manifestation of your double standards. As for the Crimea, this question is closed. Residents of the Peninsula have made their choice freely and voluntarily in accordance with the UN Charter. They will tell us about their choice themselves on the 17th of March. Whatever sanctions you introduce, whatever provocations you promote, nothing will change this reality. So I advise our Ukrainian colleagues to study well the mistakes that they have committed in the past, correct them, and stop building anti-Russia instead of building Ukraine. We miss our good neighbors and would be glad to receive them and all of you as guests and tourists in flourishing Crimea. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mexico. Political Coordinator, His Excellency Mr. Ochoa. Please. Please unmute your mic.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. First of all, I would like to thank the conveners of this Arria-formula meeting. Mexico supports dialogue and diplomacy as the means for peaceful settlement of conflicts. At the onset, we wish to stress in the most emphatic manner that there is no military solution to the crisis and affirm sustained political will is fundamental. We recall the need to respect the unity and territorial integrity of Ukraine in accordance with international law, in particular the UN Charter, and recall General Assembly Resolution 68-62. We are concerned about the reports of discriminations against ethnic minorities and human rights violation. In this regard, it is important to provide unimpeded access for all UN and OHCHR human rights monitoring personnel in Crimea. Cognizant of the grave impact of the illicit traffic and transfer, accumulation, and misuse of small arms and light and heavy weapons on the stability of the region, we underscore the importance of strengthening national and regional measures and strategies to control international weapon transfers and the supply of munition and ammunition. We welcome the efforts of the OSCE in this respect. Controlling the flow of weapons would surely constitute important confidence-building measures. We will also continue to follow the situation in eastern Ukraine and reaffirm the importance of complying with Security Council Resolution 2202. We call on the Trilateral Contact Group and the Normandy Quartet to revamp efforts to advance dialogue in order to achieve a comprehensive negotiation and peaceful solution to the conflict. The repercussions of the conflict in Ukraine, which is entering its 7th year, affects the civilian population. Mexico emphasizes the importance of giving special attention to the elderly and persons with disabilities, women, children, and minorities. We must not disregard or obviate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has and continues to have on the most vulnerable. Thus, we restate the importance of respecting international humanitarian law and to allow for safe and unhindered access of humanitarian personnel to those requiring aid or assistance. We, as the international community, must enhance mediation efforts to support the peaceful settlement of disputes, especially regarding the situation of Crimea, and build trust through cooperation on conflict prevention, crisis management, and post-conflict rehabilitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is China, Consular, His Excellency Mr. Tsing. Please.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. China's position on Crimea remains unchanged. It is not our plan to make statement at this meeting. But however, one of the briefer made baseless allegations against China during her statement. It is unacceptable. We hope that the briefers can base their statements on facts. Thank you, Ms. Chair.
Thank you. We have heard the statements by the UN Security Council, and now we'll proceed with statements by other members of the United Nations. I would now like to give the floor to Slovenia. His Excellency, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Logar. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to participate in this virtual event, and I thank Estonia and additional co-sponsors for the opportunity to mark the 7th anniversary by once again raising our voices against illegal annexation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. I would like to begin by reaffirming Slovenia's unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. Today's discussion is an important occasion to reaffirm the importance of territorial integrity and political independence as the two central concepts of the international order that emerged after the end of World War II. They should never be misinterpreted as a privilege possessed only by some powers. These concepts of international law are general and universal, and they must be respected and upheld. We must not turn a blind eye, nor become tired of exposing and condemning those who are breaching them. 7 years after the illegal annexation of the Crimea Peninsula, the human rights situation is deeply concerning. Arbitrary detentions, torture, sexual violence, deportations, they have no place in a civilized society. To prevent further deterioration of the humanitarian crisis in Crimea, we call on Russia to comply with commitment made under the international humanitarian law. In addition, human rights organizations need to be granted access to the Crimea. They are the eyes and the ears of the international community. We have the right to know and obligation to react. Slovenia is also concerned with growing military presence on the peninsula, ongoing militarization, building a massive military potential, forced conscriptions, military propaganda, and military training of youth can dangerously destabilize economic and social situation of the region. It can also pose a threat to peace and regional security. We call on Russia to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw its military forces from Crimea and end its temporary occupation of the territory of Ukraine. In conclusion, I would like to underline that the collective responsibility to fulfill the founding principle enshrined in the United Nations Charter. Effective multilateralism, international law, and rule-based order are not to be chosen from, they are to be respected in whole and in good faith. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to European Union. Deputy Secretary General for Political Affairs of the European External Action Service, His Excellency Mr. Mora. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to first thank Estonia, member of the European Union, for organizing this event. The illegal annexation of the Crimean Peninsula started 7 years ago. Today, as always, the EU stands in full solidarity with Ukraine, supporting its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The illegal annexation remains a direct challenge to international security, with grave, serious implications for the international legal order. This issue is not only a serious bilateral or European concern, but a global one. The increasing Russian militarization of Crimea and Sevastopol has had a negative impact on the security situation of the whole Black Sea region. The restrictions to the unhindered and free passage of ships through the Kerch Strait by Russia are clear violations of international law. The EU reconfirms its implementation of its consistent non-recognition policy of the illegal annexation, including through restrictive measures, together with our partners. We call on all the states to consider similar non-recognition measures in line with the UN General Assembly Resolution 68/262. The European Union calls on Russia to comply with international commitments. The violations related to the legal annexation must be prevented and justice sought for victims. We welcome the approach of Ukraine to seek justice using the international legal system. The European Court of Human Rights, in arbitration courts and the International Court of Justice, the decision of the European Court of Human Rights on 14 January, recognizing that Russia has exercised de facto control on Crimea since 27 March 2014, is very important in these regards. The European Union supports the work of international organizations in this regard, the OSCE, the Council of Europe, and of course the United Nations. We welcome Ukraine's diplomatic efforts, and we are currently studying the proposals related to the International Crimean Platform. Allow me to stress that the deterioration of the situation of human rights on the peninsula, which is particularly worrying as a direct consequence of the illegal annexation. Residents of the peninsula face systematic restrictions in their fundamental freedoms. The rights of the Crimea Tatars had been particularly targeted through the shutting down of Crimean Tatar media outlets and the banning of the activities of the Mejlis, their self-governing body, and the persecution of its leaders and members of the community. The EU expects Russia to reverse these decisions and to end the pressure on the Crimean Tatar community. In accordance with UN General Assembly Resolution 75/29, it is crucial that all human rights violations are investigated, and international human rights actors must have full, free, and unrestricted access to the peninsula. Ukraine is not alone in the face of this undermining of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The European Union will keep enforcing its strong non-recognition policy of this illegal annexation, and recall, as I do today, that Crimea is Ukraine. Crimea is Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to Romania. State Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Mr. Nicolescu. Please.
Thank you very much. 7 years after the illegal annexation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol by the Russian Federation, Romania reiterates its strong condemnation of this act, which violates the principles of the international law. We reaffirm on this occasion our steadfast support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine and its internationally recognized borders. Romania also supports the strict implementation of the non-recognition policy developed by the European Union in coordination with its Euro-Atlantic and international partners. We consider that the situation concerning the illegally occupied Crimea should remain high on the agenda of the international community as a constant reminder and expression of our collective stance and commitment to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, as well as of the importance of upholding the international law. Romania is constantly contributing to Ukraine's initiative within the UN system related to the illegal annexation of Crimea. In particular, Romania has supported every year the Ukrainian proposal to introduce the item situation of the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine on the agenda of the UN General Assembly session. For the last 3 consecutive years, Romania supported and co-sponsored the resolution initiated by Ukraine concerning the militarization of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, Ukraine, as well as the annual resolutions on the situation of human rights in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, Ukraine. Romania denounces the continued militarization of the Crimean Peninsula, which affects the stability and security in the Black Sea region and the Euro-Atlantic area. At the same time, we are worried of the efforts to forcibly integrate the illegally annexed Crimea and Sevastopol into Russia. The construction and commissioning of a bridge between Crimea and Russian continental part in April 2018, as well as the launching of the railway transportation in December 2019, represent further violations of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We cannot discuss about the consequences of Crimea's illegal annexation without paying attention to the dire human rights situation in the peninsula. Residents of the peninsula face systematic restrictions such as the right to freedom of expression, religion, belief and association, and the right to peacefully assemble. The human rights of the Crimean Tatars have been particularly targeted. Romania joins other countries and calls for the immediate release of all imprisoned human rights defenders. We are concerned about the poor state of their health in need of appropriate medical care. Romania welcomes Ukraine's diplomatic initiatives as well as its efforts to seek justice using international legal instruments and courts, including the European Court of Human Rights, in arbitration courts, the International Court of Justice. I would like to thank you for your attention and also to like to thank our Estonian colleagues for organizing this timely discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to Croatia. Permanent Representative, His Excellency Mr. Simonovic. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the outset, allow me to thank Estonia and other co-sponsors for convening this debate, as well as invited speakers for their insight. 7 years on, since the illegal annexation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol by the Russian Federation, we reaffirm our consistent position of non-recognition of the annexation as an act contrary to international law. We remain deeply concerned by the crisis in Crimea and by its impact on regional and global security and stability. It undermines the principles of international law, the rules-based order, and the peaceful coexistence of independent states. The human rights situation on the Crimean Peninsula has severely deteriorated. The COVID-19 pandemic has only worsened it. Residents of the peninsula face systematic restrictions of human rights and fundamental freedoms, such as the rights to freedom of expression, religion or belief and association, and the right to peaceful assembly. In particular, the human rights of the Crimean Tatars have been targeted. In this regard, it is crucial that the regional and international human rights monitoring mechanisms, as well as the non-governmental human rights organizations, have unimpeded access to the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. We welcome the work of Ukrainian human rights organizations and the Crimean prosecutor, who temporarily from mainland Ukraine record human rights violations. We also continue to support critical protection, monitoring, reporting and advocacy work of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the UN Human Rights Monitoring Commission in Ukraine. Mr. Chair, we are concerned about the worrying trend of imposing Russian citizenship on Crimean residents and conscripting them into Russian armed forces. We're also deeply concerned by the increasing militarization of the peninsula by the Russian Federation, including multiple military exercises and the construction of warships, which continues to have a negative impact on the security situation in the Black Sea region. At this point, to the fact that it is very important to keep Crimea high on the international agenda. Sustainable peace and stability in the region can only be achieved if the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders is restored and respected. Let me finish by underlining once again that Croatia has been and shall remain unwavering in its support for Ukraine's sovereignty, unity and territorial integrity, as well as prosperity and well-being of its people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Denmark. Permanent representative, His Excellency Mr. Herman, who will deliver a statement on behalf of the Nordic countries. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me the floor and for organizing this. I have the honor to speak, as you said, on behalf of the Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark. 7 years on since the illegal annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty continues to be violated by the Russian Federation. Russia's actions have not only endangered the security in Europe, but also weakened the basis for international cooperation. Russia's aggression against Ukraine is a blatant breach of international law. It violates the UN Charter, and it is therefore of global concern. For this reason, we welcome this timely meeting. The position of the Nordic countries is firm. We do not, and we will not, recognize the illegal annexation of Ukraine's Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol by the Russian Federation. We remain steadfast in our commitment to international law and Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, including its territorial waters. We are fully committed to the EU's non-recognition policy, including restrictive measures. We urge Russia to respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine in accordance with the UN General Assembly Resolution 68/262. Honorable Chair, we are deeply worried by the constantly deteriorating human rights situation in Crimea. We remain concerned about the arbitrary detentions and politically motivated convictions, especially of Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians, as well as the increasing pressure on journalists and other media actors, human rights defenders, and civil society actors. Neither the rights to freedom of expression, religion or belief, peaceful assembly and association, economic, social and cultural rights, nor the freedom of media are respected. As also documented in the reports by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Russian citizenship and compulsory conscription in the armed forces of the Russian Federation have been imposed on Crimean residents. These actions are in blatant breach of international law and violate the rules and principles that Russia has committed to. We call on Russia to abide by its international obligations and respect its obligations under international law as the occupying power. As stated in a number of UN General Assembly resolutions on the human rights situation in Crimea, we urge Russia to immediately and unconditionally release all arbitrarily detained and imprisoned Ukrainian nationals held in Crimea and Russia. We urge Russia to ensure international humanitarian actors and international representatives and monitors full and unhindered access to the areas currently not under the control of Ukraine, including the Crimean Peninsula. We express grave concern regarding the continuing militarization of Crimea, which undermines the security in the whole Black Sea region. The discriminatory inspection regime at the Kerch Strait limits navigation to and from Ukrainian ports, with negative economic consequences for Ukraine and third countries. We also call for Russia to refrain from impeding the lawful exercise of navigational rights and freedoms in the Black Sea, the Sea of Azov, and the Kerch Strait in accordance with applicable international law. Honorable Chair, the Nordic countries reiterate our firm support for Ukraine. We are convinced that the respect for international law and a rules-based world order are fundamental for our common security and for multilateral cooperation. We call on members of the international community to remain steadfast in their non-recognition policies in line with Resolution 68/262. We urge Russia to abide by international law, including international humanitarian law, and uphold its international commitments. We call for the Secretary General and the UN to continue their efforts to restore respect for the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence of Ukraine. I thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to Republic of Korea. Your Excellency, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This year marks the 30-year anniversary of the independence of Ukraine. The Republic of Korea reiterates its continued support for the sovereignty, independence, and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. The stability of Ukraine is important not only to peace in Europe, but also far beyond it. My delegation welcomes the significant decrease in the level of violence since the July 2020 agreement of indefinite ceasefire. However, we are still concerned by the security incidents and in several hotspots along the contact line in recent months. Without meaningful progress in political negotiations, any gains or relative stability achieved will be left exposed to the risk of backsliding. In this vein, we emphasize the importance of fully implementing Security Council Resolution 2202, conclusion of the Normandy Format Summit, and the indefinite ceasefire agreed to by the Trilateral Contact Group last July. The resolution of the situation in eastern region of Ukraine can only be achieved through a peaceful settlement to the current crisis. We call on all sides to engage constructively in the Normandy format and the Trilateral Contact Group with a view to fully implementing the Minsk agreements. My delegation also supports the important role of OSCE Special Monitoring Mission. 7 years of conflict have taken a heavy toll on the civilian population, especially on the vulnerable people, including women and children. The Republic of Korea is concerned about the difficult humanitarian situation on the ground and the accounts of how the COVID-19 pandemic has compounded the challenging socio-economic conditions, as reported by OHCHR. My delegation emphasized the need to ensure unhindered humanitarian access, and we commend the work of UN to provide life-saving assistance to all areas in need. The Republic of Korea, in cooperation with UN and other international partners, will continue its support toward a peaceful political resolution of the conflict. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to Japan. His Excellency Ambassador Mr. Namazu. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ministers, Excellencies, it is my honor to participate in this Arria-formula meeting and have the opportunity to listen to the detailed update on the situation on the ground, as well as important statements from the senior level participants. It appears that I am one of the few speakers from Asia, from outside the Security Council. I am here today to show Japan's solidarity and our interests in this topic. Stability in Ukraine, including Crimea, is critical for the international security environment. This is not just a European issue, but one of global concern. On the issue of Crimea, Japan respects the internationally recognized borders and consistently supports the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Listening to the briefers today, I am deeply concerned with the overall human rights situation in Crimea, where Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and others have pointed to a sharp deterioration. Tokyo supports and appreciates the efforts by the United Nations, OSCE, and the Council of Europe to monitor the situation and to resolve all issues related to Crimea, including such efforts as the adoption of relevant UN General Assembly resolutions. We urge the authorities in Crimea to immediately cooperate with OHCHR and others by allowing unconditional access to Crimea. It is essential for the international community to continue to pay close attention to the situation in Crimea and to speak up to solve the intractable problems and bring stability to the region. Together with the international community and international organizations, Japan will continue to work towards the resolution of the situation in Crimea. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Austria, Permanent Representative, His Excellency Mr. Marcik. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President. And Austria, of course, also aligns itself with the statement delivered by the EU. Let me thank Assistant Secretary General Kehris and the civil society representatives for their work and for the briefing today. Dear colleagues, 7 years ago, Russia's aggressive actions in Ukraine's Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol led to the illegal annexation of the peninsula. For 7 years, the people of Ukraine suffered the devastating consequences of a dire security situation. For 7 years, Austria repeated its principled position based on international law at the OSCE, the Council of Europe, and the UN. Let me be clear. Austria does not recognize the illegal annexation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol by Russia. Legally, this territory remains part of Ukraine. Austria joins others in condemning this violation of international law and fully supports the non-recognition policy and the restrictive measures of the EU. Further, we call for the end of the ongoing Russian militarization of the Crimean Peninsula and the unjustified use of force, which continues to negatively impact the security situation in the Black Sea region and beyond. We are deeply concerned about the transfers of advanced weapon systems to the territory of Ukraine, as well as the illegal seizure and establishment of control by Russia over the former nuclear weapons storage sites in Crimea. Both are in violation of security assurances extended to Ukraine by Russia, among others, when Ukraine joined the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state after the destruction of its nuclear arsenal. Austria also remains concerned about the lack of effective investigation into conflict-related human rights violations, such as arbitrary detention, torture, and ill treatment in the non-government controlled areas of Ukraine. All such violations must be investigated and perpetrators brought to justice. We are alarmed by the lack of protection, by the intimidation and prosecution of journalists, other media workers, human rights defenders, defense lawyers, LGBTI persons, civil society, and by the situation of minority communities. Human rights must be implemented by everyone and everywhere. We call on all sides to fully respect and implement their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law. Together with increased efforts at demining, this is key for the protection of civilians in Crimea. In this respect, we also call on Russia to grant full, unconditional, and unrestricted access to international and humanitarian actors, including OHCHR and the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine. We also call on Russia to ensure free passage to and from the Sea of Azov in accordance with international law, and to stop resettlement of its civilian population to the peninsula, and to stop forcing the local population to adopt Russian passports. The COVID-19 pandemic puts additional strains on the humanitarian situation. We need to reflect on how the international community can help mitigate the impact of COVID-19, especially on minorities. Let me conclude by restating Austria's full support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the last section of our debate today. It is my honor to give the floor back to our distinguished briefers for their additional comments. Please limit yourself to 3 minutes. Let us start with Dr. Philip Karber, followed by Ms. Maria Tomak. Dr. Karber, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, first I'd like to respond to the Russian minister. He seemed to object to what was said by the briefers. In my case, I would encourage them for their meeting in March to present their own data. So if you don't like mine, show us where your military forces are. And you don't like the numbers, adjust them, tell us what they really are. And if one wants to establish veracity, then how about inviting international inspectors to Feodosia, and so that we can understand that nuclear weapons aren't being deployed there, even though they're rebuilding the facility. It's a way of establishing their credibility. It's a true honor to have been here today, and to also hear the extent of the solidarity of many of the sponsors and members of the United Nations. I would add 2 comments to it, and not to take away from anything that's already been said. But first of all, and I think it's right that there was attention and continuing attention given to the plight of Crimea. But having spent 182 days in the combat zone in the Donbass, I would say that for all the horrors that are going on in Crimea, they pale in comparison to the impact of 7 of war. And as I said several times earlier, Crimea and the Donbass are inextricably linked, both militarily and politically. And so I think it's important not to take our eye off of what's really going on in the Donbass. It is also a humanitarian disaster on both sides of the conflict line. My last point is really related to we have a tendency, I think, to talk about humanitarian over here and military buildup over here as if they're related in geography, but not really intellectually or analytically. If you think about it, war is the penultimate anti-humanitarian act. Nuclear war is the ultimate humanitarian and environmental disaster. When countries brag about and threaten and brag and display their nuclear forces, or deploy them secretly, it there is underneath that an enormous humanitarian potential impact. And I would encourage people to think of it not as just a military issue, but the humanitarian impact of these weapons being used, and those who emphasize them or rely on them. They need to be paper trained to live in a modern international community. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Karber, for your most valuable reflection. Now, Ms. Maria Tomak, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would also like to thank to all of the speakers, those who supported Ukraine and supported this initiative. It's extremely important for us, as well as for those people who live in Crimea and who suffer from the persecutions and from other human rights violations. I would also like to thank to Dr. Philip Karber. I think that his speech was very, very accurate, straight and forward, and described very well developments in Ukraine. So it's very valuable for us as well. A few reactions from my side. I would like to say that Crimea is not a political issue. It is a legal issue. It is a matter of the violation of the international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. So it is very important to remember that. Also, I would like to stress that it's important to demand from the Russian Federation to guarantee full, free, and unrestricted access for the international humanitarian organizations and human rights actors to the whole territory of Ukraine, including, of course, Crimea, as well as temporarily occupied Donbass. It's important to maintain sanctions. Let me once again to go back to this issue and to stress the importance of Crimean-related sanctions as a tool for making pressure on Russian Federation, which I'm sure will result in the deoccupation of Crimea. I would just like to say that, reacting towards the words of the representative of the Russian Federation, that I visited Crimea even after 2014, so your information is false, basically. And what I've seen there is a very oppressed people threatened by the authoritarian regime which is now established in this occupied territory. And just to finish my final remarks, I would like to assure Mr. Representative of the Russian Federation that Crimean question is not closed. And today's meeting and the support towards the Crimean platform is another proof for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your most valuable additional comments, Ms. Tomak. Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of our meeting today. We have heard valuable insights and first-hand information about the deteriorating situation in Crimea. Our meeting today clearly demonstrated that Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and continued violation of human rights must stop. And until it is not the case, this matter must remain high on our agenda. On behalf of Estonia and all 23 co-sponsors, I sincerely thank you all for your valuable participation.